Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Lionel Foster, and I am Communications Director for the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty. Just a few notes before we get started. This webinar is being recorded. The slides and the recording will be sent out after the webcast. All participants are muted right now, and one of the absolute best parts of this conversation will be the portion when we finally get to interact with you. There will be a question and answer session at the end, but there's no need to wait till the end to send us your questions. The more we get sooner, the better, and the more we can get to. We really look forward to that. So as your questions occur to you, please go ahead and type your questions or comments in the question box on the right side of your screen. Please be sure to include your name and organization so that it's always exciting to know exactly who is tuning in, who we're talking to. And we're tweeting under the hashtag mobility from poverty. So the topic for this webinar, what is it that we really mean when we talk about mobility, and how do we measure it, is one that has generated a lot of interest. So we're happy today to share some of what we've learned and tools that we hope you'll find useful in your work. We have speakers today from two different coasts. Hazel Rose Marcus is the Davis Bragg Professor in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University and Faculty Co-Director of Stanford SPARQ. SPARQ is Stanford Psychology's do tank. They partner with organizations to reduce disparities in criminal justice, economic mobility, education, and health. Her work examines how cultures shape thought, feeling, and action. And Nisha Patel, whom many of you know and many of you have heard from before on our webcast, is Executive Director of the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty. Nisha has nearly 2 decades of experience leading, developing, and implementing initiatives to increase economic opportunity. You will hear first from Nisha and then Hazel. So right now, over to you, Nisha.
Thank you, Lionel, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited for today's webinar, and my job is just to give you a little bit of context about the partnership before turning things over to Hazel. And so as you'll see on the slide in front of you, a bit about the people involved. The partnership is chaired by David Elwood at the Harvard Kennedy School. It's funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and staffed and supported by our team here at the Urban Institute. And as you can see on the screen, the partnership is comprised of 24 members who come from incredibly diverse fields and perspectives. The majority are people of color, and we have people from very different sectors and different political points of view. And so you'll see some names that you recognize. We have economists, psychologists, sociologists, people who are running programs on the ground. We have 5 MacArthur geniuses, including Jennifer Eberhardt, who is a social psychologist and a colleague of Hazel's and one of the collaborators on the work that we're going to be talking about today. And one of the other things I always like to emphasize is that we're not a consensus group, and that has actually led to, in some ways, much more robust proposals. So not every partner agrees with every or supports every individual idea that we've put forward, but we've got a really robust set of proposals, and the topic we're talking about today actually cuts across all of the proposals. So if we go to the next slide, the next slide really is the topic for today, and I'm really excited because we've done a series of webinars, but on this one we really get to go deep on what I think is one of the most exciting insights coming out of the partnership, which is the definition of mobility that we've put forward. And many of you who've been with us kind of on this journey in this series of webinars know that the partnership really had one task, one big, bold question that we were asked to think creatively about and answer, which is, what would it take to dramatically increase mobility from poverty? And of course, in doing that, we first had to define, well, what would success look like? What do we mean by mobility? And as we started our work, we very intentionally didn't limit ourselves to a traditional narrow definition of poverty. And I give our chair, David Elwood, a lot of credit for that. It was very much his vision to push our group to think much more broadly. And I think, early on we realized if we focused narrowly on income, then all we would have to do is develop ideas, a set of strategies to help people move $1 above the federal poverty level, for example. And it would appear that our work was done. But when in fact, if we stop and we think about that, you realize if a family of 4, if we use the federal poverty line, let's say instead of making $24,600, they're now at $24,601. Are they really better off? Are they really on a pathway to mobility? And I think pretty quickly you start to see that in many cases, these families would continue to struggle. And so, we said absolutely economic success, the kinds of things we traditionally measure when we talk about poverty, matter greatly. So things like income and assets and wage gains are super important. In fact, they're fundamental, they're foundational, but they're not enough. And inside our very first gathering of the partnership, as we were talking about how we would measure success, John Powell, one of our partnership members who's based at UC Berkeley, said, here's the thing about poverty. It's not just about a lack of money. It's also about a lack of power. And that immediately resonated with our group, and it's resonated in communities we've been with or spoken with around the country. And so we added a second principle to the definition, which is equally important, which is this notion of power and autonomy, which really speaks to having a sense of agency over one's life, as well as the say in the trajectory of your life and in what happens in your community. And then third, and equally important, as we started to talk about this, is this notion that we describe as being valued in community. And what's particularly interesting about this principle is that it emerged from partnership members who come sort of politically from the right and from the left. So Arthur Brooks, who's one of our partnership members and heads up the American Enterprise Institute, he comes from a more conservative perspective, and he often talks about this concept as dignity, right? As having dignity, being needed, having meaning. And John Powell, who I mentioned, who comes from a much more progressive perspective, often talks about this concept as belonging as opposed to othering, right? Belonging in community. And others will sometimes describe this concept as social inclusion, and it's also related to social connection and social capital. And so these three principles have been informed not just by our own deliberations within the partnership, but by conversations that we've had around the country. I think all told, we visited 30 different organizations and communities and have found that these principles have strongly resonated with diverse audiences. And ideally, each of the ideas and strategies that the partnership is putting forward would embody all three of these principles. And importantly for the conversation today, we would also begin to measure outcomes across all three of these principles. And I really think that this has the potential to be game-changing. As we all know, what we choose to measure and the outcomes that we attain end up driving strategy. They drive both public and private investments. They drive program design, and ultimately not just the services that are delivered, but how services are delivered, right? So are services delivered with dignity, with respect, and in ways that foster agency and belonging? And I know, as you all know, I always like to take a look at the registration list, and we have a good number of you on the phone today who I know help lead research and evaluation efforts at foundations. And this is, I want to, really, I'm really pleased that you're joining us, because I think there's a potentially really powerful role, in particular, that those of you working in research and evaluation philanthropy can play, which is around building capacity in the field to measure all three of these constructs. And we'll have a great conversation today, but I also want to note that we have a paper that we have, those of us at the partnership and the Urban Institute have worked closely with our colleagues at SPARQ on, that we released last week on measuring mobility. And I know much of what Hazel will talk about is based on what's in that paper. So that's another resource for those of you that want more information. Okay, if we go to the last slide, I will just close by talking about the strategies that the partnership has put forward, because these are the strategies across which we want to measure outcomes on the three principles that I just talked about. And so our other sort of big insight from the partnership, which I think won't surprise any of you on the call, is that dramatically increasing mobility from poverty, there's no one magic strategy that's going to do it all. It's really going to require investment across 5 big mutually reinforcing strategies, which we think of as narrative, jobs, place, people, and data for short, and it's going to require cross-sector collaboration. So we believe we need to change the narrative around poverty and how we talk about poverty and people in poverty in the U.S. We need to focus on creating access to good jobs. Third, we have an aspiration around ensuring that zip code isn't destiny, and a variety of ideas that fall under that strategy. Fourth, we want to provide support that empowers, which is really about putting people and families at the center and of our service delivery. And I think that really speaks to these notions of agency, power, and autonomy. And then finally, we want to transform data use, which undergirds all of these strategies. And we know that no one government agency, one philanthropy or organization can do it alone, but we believe by working together, we can dramatically increase mobility from poverty. And so now I want to turn things over to Hazel, who has really in-depth expertise along with her colleagues at SPARQ on measuring constructs like power and autonomy and being valued in community. So Hazel, take it away.
Thanks, Nisha. Hello from California. Good morning. Building just on what Nisha was spelling out, as psychologists, we know that mobility from poverty will depend on more material resources, better food, wages, houses, schools, and healthcare. But we also know that more material resources, although necessary, are not sufficient. People also will need social resources. And when I say social resources, what do I mean? I mean, people in all contexts want two things. One, they want to feel that they have some power, some autonomy and control over their lives. And two, they want to know that they matter, that they belong, that they are seen, that they have some dignity and are valued and respected. Now, this is a challenge for all of us, these two things, but particularly they are a challenge in low income and poverty contexts that every day pose significant threats to the idea that one is capable or that one matters. What social psychologists observe, and I imagine what many practitioners participating in the seminar or in the webinar today observe, is that some people in low income or poverty contexts do okay, even better than okay, but other people in the very same circumstances that we can observe seem to suffer. Why is that? The claim of a great deal of social psychology research is that people will do better and experience better outcomes of all types and can move from poverty when they feel they have some power and autonomy and when they feel valued in their communities. And programs and interventions and policies that foster power and autonomy and feeling valued in the community will be those that will be most effective in increasing mobility. So what I want to do today is quickly is to define power and autonomy and define being valued in community, show some examples of scales that will allow people to measure these important social resources. And what I'm doing here is a preview of the Measuring Mobility Toolkit that will be released at the end of June. And this toolkit will include a wide variety of measures for both power and autonomy and feeling valued in community, and will describe how to use these scales and when to use them. So as you can see in the overview slide here, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to first just quickly talk about what we know about low income and poverty contexts and how they influence psychological functioning. So on the next slide, I have put what I think everyone knows, that our poverty rates have been unchanged since 1965. So our question today is, what can social psychology contribute? And what we think we can contribute with this research is a fuller understanding of the psychological experience of poverty, ways to measure the psychology of people, and some ideas and methods for working to increase mobility from poverty. So on the next slide is a slide that summarizes just quickly some of what we know. We know that people in poverty contexts have worse health, shorter lives, they're more likely to experience trauma, they're often a target of negative stereotypes about being poor, and also intersecting stereotypes about race, about gender, about sexual orientation. People in poverty and lower income contexts are also likely to work jobs with less choice and control, to have fewer choices in their lives among fewer attractive options. They're more likely to interact with family and longtime friends than with people or connections that are looser or more casual. They're very likely to teach children to fit in, to observe hierarchy, to follow norms. This is good parenting practice in the kinds of contexts that are low-income poverty contexts. They're more religious. They're also more likely to be empathic. they give a larger proportion of their income to others when they have the opportunity to do that. They show more loyalty in their relationships, and they're very often to view themselves as strong and resilient. So you can see here there's a gradation that we reflected with the colors from things that are quite clearly negative to some others aspects of behavior that are neutral, or even some have some positive aspects to life in low-income or poverty contexts. Now, on the next two slides, I'm not going to go over them, but I just want them to be available in the webinar. We've sketched out the latest findings on the psychological tendencies of people in higher and lower income contexts, and we've included references to all the studies that support these generalizations. I'm not going to go over slide 5 or slide 6 in detail, but they're here to support the idea that the differences between people in low income contexts and those in high income contexts are not just stereotypes, but are empirical generalizations based on many types of studies. Let me just sum up these two slides, 4 and 5. What they show is that people in higher income contexts with more resources are likely to prioritize the individual achievement, control, planning, and the future. And their social networks, which are very much tied to their psychologies, are relatively loose and dispersed. In contrast, people in low-income and poverty contexts with many fewer material resources are more likely to prioritize being part of relationships, family, groups. There will be less focus on individual achievement and success, and more focus on group success. There will be more focus on the present and a greater sensitivity to disrespect. These social networks of people in low-income poverty contexts are also more likely to be tight and contained. So you can see there's a lot here, but there's a lot that we're learning. What I want to emphasize is about these three slides, 3, 4, and 5. They reflect differences in ways of being that are not essential or inherent differences, but differences in ways of behaving that are a consequence of adjusting to the different circumstances of people's lives. So these findings that are sketched out here give us some good clues about people's psychologies, about people's lives, and what we can do, draw on, and use and leverage to help produce mobility from poverty, what will be entailed. But very importantly, if you change the circumstances of people's lives, you will change their psychologies. And in turn, when you start to change their psychologies, producing more feelings of power and autonomy and being included in community, you will change their circumstances. So, okay, now to the next slide. Good. So this is just the model that Nisha sketched out. And now go to the next slide. And in measuring power and autonomy and inclusion in community, we need reliable, valid, and culturally equivalent scales. And that's what we've been putting a lot of work on. And the scales that we have, we'll show you today, and the ones that will be included in the toolkit, are reliable in that they consistently measure the construct across components of the scale and across various population groups and time. That's a challenge. There are many scales out there, but not all of them are reliable. We want valid scales which accurately and completely measure the construct. And finally, we want scales that are culturally equivalent, meaning they reliably and validly measure the same construct in different cultural groups. And this is also a challenge because of, as I just spelled out, people in contexts, different income contexts are likely to have some differences in their ways of thinking and feeling. And so we've worked hard to get scales that we know will meet these criteria. Next slide. We have a variety of other concerns here. One is, will these scales work for Americans with low income? It's no secret that most research has been done on what we call in the social sciences now weird populations. Weird populations is an acronym for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So we know a lot about people in white middle-class contexts, and we know much less about the 85% of the world's people who are not in those so-called weird contexts. So we want to know if these scales that have been used a lot will also work for Americans in low-income, less formally educated contexts. And so we've worked hard to pick the ones that have worked in these contexts. We know that they will predict outcomes for people in low-income contexts, and we know that participants will be able to understand the questions. We look at issues like, how wonky do the questions sound? Is the reading level a basic reading level so everyone can understand the ideas? This isn't true for all of the measures that are out there. Okay, so on the next slide, I'm going to start now talking about the first big category that we've spelled out, power and autonomy. This also is called agency. Power refers to a person's ability to influence their environment, other people, and their own outcomes. This is a feeling that they have capacity to act in their own lives. Autonomy is a person's capacity to act according to their own decisions. And we want measurements that reflect people's different ways of having power and autonomy given their various situational constraints. Next slide. As I said at the beginning, people everywhere need a sense of power, but what gives rise to power, we have learned, varies. So it's really essential to consider the circumstances and contexts of people's lives. People always want to act, but how they can act depends on what are the details of their situations. Next slide. One of the good measures that is a reliable and valid scale for tapping, measuring power and autonomy is a scale called the sense of control scale. And we have it spelled out here. It involves questions about personal mastery as well as questions about perceived constraint. So you can see an example of personal mastery is when I really want to do something, I usually find a way to succeed at it. Now this pairs mastery with constraint. An example of constraint item is what happens in my life is beyond my control. So you can see that people are who think that they can take charge in their lives, have control in their lives, will get a relatively high score on sense of control. For people who are feeling that things are just too much for them, they don't have this feeling of being in charge, will have a lower score. So if you can go to the next slide, I'll show you an example of one of the findings with the personal mastery part of this scale. And this looks at the very important outcome of health, which is one of those very important outcomes beyond how much money are you making each week that the partnership is looking at, because health determines so much else of what you can do. And what you can see here with health, at high levels of personal mastery, if you look to the right of the graph, the first graph, which is on the left, but look at the part circled in red, you can see that at high levels of personal mastery, you will see better self-rated health. And if you look to the next graph on the right, circled there, people with high levels of personal mastery, if they say, if I can do what I want to do in my life, I can accomplish it, they will have fewer acute symptoms. So, and this is, if you can see, there are three income groups here. And what you can see that for the low income groups in both of these graphs, that having a high level of personal mastery, feeling that you can indeed do what you want to do, find a way to succeed in your life despite its constraints, that this will be associated with much better health. And the next graph is a similar graph that looks at constraints. So if you go to the next slide, which is perceived constraints. This is the second part of the sense of control scale. What you can see is that for people who have lower scores, they feel less constrained, they don't feel so helpless and hopeless, they report having fewer functional limitations. Functional limitations are like, can you walk upstairs? Can you walk 2 blocks without getting out of breath? So you can see that the sense of control, which is a very important part of power, has a direct relationship with one's physical health. And of course, one's physical health has everything to do with how well people can do in all the other activities of their life, taking care of their family, school, work, etc. Okay, let me move now to a second scale. And once again, this is a second example, scale of one that's well validated and reliable scale. Is called the Shift and Persist scale. This is once again a 2-part scale that captures what people in their context are doing, and it measures 2 strategies for dealing with stressful situations. Low-income poverty contexts are low-resource, stressful, unstable situations. So if you can shift, which means accepting stress and adapting yourself to it, and at the same time persist in finding meaning and optimism in the face of this adversity, this seems to have very good effect on your health. And we're finding out more and more about how people can do this and how we can support people in shifting and persisting. If you move to the next slide, I'll give you an example of the items. Shift items are items like when something stressful happens in your life, and these would be items, and you answer, I think about what I can learn from the situation, or I think about the positive aspects or the good that can come from the situation. And then when something doesn't turn out the way you want and you are not able to change it, I think about what good things can come from the situation, or I think about what I can learn. So this is tapping people who find a way in very difficult and constrained circumstances to reappraise and to find something good that they can hang on to, or some meaning that's really critical, this shifting, and then put together with the persisting. So they shift, but they can still say there's some purpose in my life. I feel that there's a larger reason, and that it's this combination that seems to be particularly predictive, once again, for health. If you go to the next slide, a variety of studies with in low SES contexts. For example, low, and I haven't said SES, it stands for socioeconomic status. I use this on many slides. I should have said it earlier. Low children in low income contexts who have higher shift and persist scores have lower levels of inflammation. And this is a biological marker that's linked to almost all the big diseases that you can think of, particularly diabetes and heart disease. If you have lower levels of inflammation, then you are in good shape. Higher inflammation is problematic, and it's also related to body weight index, BMI. And so what these studies show is that the children who are finding ways to both reappraise, take some meaning out of the difficult circumstances in their life are those children who are healthier. Very notably, you don't find these same effects among high SES children. This seems to be something very important that has been uncovered about successful children in low income poverty contexts. And what we want to understand more is, what are the circumstances of their lives that foster these shift and persist tendencies. And I just want to underscore that the positive health effects really depends on both the shift and persist in combination. So now, if you move to the next slide, we're going to move to the second part of what we say people everywhere need in order to experience the well-being that will be essential for mobility from poverty. The second part is being valued in community. We define that as a person's sense that they belong, are an and are included among family, friends, coworkers, neighbors, other communities, and society. And we're looking for measure scales that pick that up, that pick up a person's sense that they have some place in their community, that they are someone, that they have some dignity, that they have some social standing. And at the same time, we want to pick up what are those barriers, what's going on in the community that doesn't allow people to feel that they are really part, that they belong, or that they have dignity. And that tends to be a sense of discrimination, a sense that there's a cold wind blowing in your face, which is a common experience for many people. Let me give you some examples of these. I'll talk first, next slide, about belongingness. This is a simple scale that can be adjusted to various contexts. So it can ask people at my work, people in my community, people at my school, accept me. Or if I wanted to, I could potentially do very well at, you can put in work, community, or school. But they're just asking people straight out, do you feel comfortable in these contexts? Do you feel that you are like the other people who succeed there? Do you fit there? And this sense of belongingness is showing itself to be an extremely vital aspect of people's performance, people's health. The next slide, I'll show you just one study. And this is a study that helped students in their first year as they began college. It provided them with a new narrative about the university, about college. Many students, and particularly minoritized students who are not in the majority group, often are worried about whether they will belong in an institution like a school. It would also be true in a workplace. When we gave students at the beginning of their first year a narrative telling them that, yes, you will struggle, everybody struggles when they make a transition to a new setting, a new school, a new workplace, but that's just normal, and you absolutely belong here, telling people through a variety of stories that we gave them. You can see that in this graph, the Black students in particular really improve with this belonging intervention over the 4 years of at college. And it makes a huge difference comparing the Black students who got the belongingness intervention to those in the gray line below that didn't get this intervention. So changing the narrative in a believable way can make a huge difference, and it's a fairly simple, low cost, but we think high impact intervention. Okay, so now going to the next slide, I want to talk about the other part of belonging. I want to talk about the cold wind that blows in the face of many people, and that's discrimination. So we have included the various types of discrimination scales. The first one here talks about lifetime discrimination. It asks people, how many times in your life have you been discriminated against in each of the following ways, based on a whole variety of social categorizations. And you can fill in the one you want, or put multiple ones, or intersections of two or more. Items like, you were discouraged by a teacher or advisor from seeking higher education. You were hassled by the police. You were denied or provided inferior medical care. These are common experiences that keep people from having this sense of dignity, of feeling like they are someone and that they belong, which is so important. The next slide shows another scale. It talks about perceived daily discriminations. And these items are very powerful. People who say yes to these are often struggle in many ways. People who will say yes to, people act as if they are afraid of you. People act as if they think you are not as good as they are. And when people report this, we know that this is associated with a whole array of bad outcomes. And we also know that this sense is common in many low-income contexts. The next slide is the cover from a recent New York Times Magazine article that asked the question, why is it that America's Black mothers and babies are in a life or death crisis, and talks about the shocking disparity between Black mothers and babies and white mothers and babies in actually staying alive during pregnancy. And the answer, as it says here, that's given in the article, an excellent article, is that this disparity in health rates has everything to do with the lived experience of being a Black woman in America. And as the next slide shows, there's another graphic, that women who report the most experiences of racism, which is a measure from the perceived discrimination scales that I just showed you, those are the women that have higher levels of preterm births and struggle themselves with health issues during pregnancy. For women who find a way, even in very poor and low income contexts, to feel that they belong and to soften that cold wind of discrimination, do much better. They do better and their babies do better. So it's a very, very important feature that we have to measure and pay much more attention to. So in the next slide, I want to just quickly tell you one other scale that is a good way to get a sense of people's sense of where they stand in their community. So it shows a ladder, and it says, think of this ladder as representing where people stand in the United States. And at the top of the ladder are people who are the best off, those who have the most money, the most education, the most respected job. At the bottom are people who are the worst off, who have the least money, least education, and least respected job. And then they simply ask people, where would you put yourself on this ladder? Well, it turns out that people's subjective sense of their standing is not completely related to their objective stance. So this is what I said before. People in this objectively same economically poor, under-resourced context can have different ideas of their own subjective social status, and that's what this MacArthur scale measures. On the next slide, it tells that the finding of many studies now is that the MacArthur scale is better at predicting self-rated health than the objective measures. So getting people to tell us, where do you stand? Because it's not always obvious. People can find a sense of themselves, a good sense of their worth and of their dignity in a variety of ways in their community. And if they do, their health will be better and their chances for mobility from poverty greater. The next slide shows that, I thought there was one more slide, sorry. But anyway, there are many studies that make this point, that subjective social status is very important. So now I want to end by saying, what can we do? How can we make a difference? And once again, I want to underscore what Nisha said at the beginning about the importance of collecting data, about the importance of trying to measure these two essential, necessary features. Power and autonomy, on one hand, being valued in community, go hand in hand. We want to identify and use the appropriate scales, the valid and reliable scales, and we want to use them to gather data both before and after programs, if possible, and to use them with our various interventions, and if possible, to always include a control group so that we have some idea if what we're doing is working. And then we want to communicate the results. And that's what I want to end on, which is the last slide. I want to talk about the Measuring Mobility from Poverty Toolkit, which is one of the partnership's projects. And what we will have available at the end of June is a wide array of measures on power and autonomy, a wide array of measures on feeling valued in community, how to use them, when to use them, other considerations that matter in using these scales. And so at the last slide, we have just a few references. We called it a place to start because there's so much work in this exciting new area. But the first reference here is to the white paper that Nisha described at the beginning, and then these references are the background for the findings that I presented here today. So thank you, and we're really ready for questions.
Thank you so much, Hazel, and thank you, Nisha. We've already gotten a few questions, and everyone else, please send them our way. We'll get to as many as possible. So, Hazel, this question is for you. It comes from Charles Holm with Economic Mobility Pathways. He asks, how do the measures you discuss relate to the Gallup questions about well-being, or Cottrell's ladders about people's evaluation of current well-being and expectation for the future?
Great question. They're both extremely related, and we've looked across all of these measures. And on the toolkit, we will include, for example, the Cantrell ladder. That's another very good and very well-used measure that's valid and reliable. Also, the Gallup well-being scales are very related to some of the scales we've shown here. So there's a pretty good growing consensus in the field about what are the good scales, but they're all tapping the same two constructs in a variety of ways, and the determination of which to use will depend on how much time do you have, sort of the age and stage of your population. You really need to look at the wording and then just decide what will make the most psychological sense, or what we call the experience near for your respondents, to kind of read the item and just see, is this going to click with the people that I'm working with? So good question.
Great. Another question for Hazel. Could you give us some context for how much where a respondent lands on some of these scales might vary over time? So, for example, could the same person respond differently if he or she happens to feel slightly more or less stressed on a particular day? And is it natural for responses to change as people age and move into different phases of their lives?
Yeah, that's another great question. And yes, that's what we look at with retest reliability, because just as you say, from the beginning of the day to the end of the day, if you're hungry or irritated or it's been one of those days, you just do respond differently, and that goes for these scales too. But what we've tried to include here are those scales that have been given to people and then given again a week later, 6 months later, or a year later. So they're fairly reliable. And that's one of our criteria for selecting them for the toolkit. But yes, there will be those variability. And when you administer them, you have to always pay attention to what are the circumstances. If you know somebody's just had a very traumatic experience, then probably not a good time to give the scales.
Okay, great. Another question for Hazel. I imagine a lot of these may be technical questions that Hazel can answer. You mentioned the fact that some people in similarly difficult circumstances can respond very differently, on the scale to some of these items. So, knowing that's the case, what are some of the factors that might account for that?
Well, that's one of the things that we're actually trying to uncover with this research. If you just look from the outsider's perspective, you think, wow, two families, both really struggling below the poverty line. And then you go and talk to people and you see in one family, they seem to be holding it together, and they could be better, but they're okay. And right next door, things can seem very different. And that's where we think that the family that's doing okay has found a way to have a sense of power and autonomy, a sense that they actually, even in very, very constrained circumstances, have some capacity to act in their life, that their actions are guided by their own decisions. And in the family next door, they for a variety of reasons don't have that feeling. And the same thing with feeling included in community. Some people, if you just look from the outside again, they can look very similar. But for example, and one thing that's very important in much of the work is that Religion plays a very important part. For some families, this is a way to provide a community at church where people feel included, where they feel that they have dignity, that they are seen, and that can provide a sense that at least on the weekend you are someone, even if in the rest of the week you get this sense from the world that you're not. So we're trying to, in this work, really begin to understand these different psychological factors and what can support these psychological factors as we go forward, because that's what mobility from poverty is going to depend on, along with more material resources, of course.
Great. There's one question I can knock out. Sonia Turner of the United Way of Greater Cincinnati asks, are there resources that also guide on measuring economic mobility? And yes, Sonia, and the partnership in SPARQ in the paper Measuring Mobility, which we released last week and Nisha mentioned earlier in the call, also goes into income and economic measures and scales. We didn't stress that on this webinar because I think many people are much more familiar with some of those tools, but the answer is yes, and you can find it in the same place. Let me see. Another question for Hazel comes from Mary with the Institute for Educational Leadership. Have these measures been applied to evaluate the effect of leadership development capacity building programs for people in low income or low SES contexts? So just to rephrase that, I think the question is, used as measurement tools for programs that are trying to support leadership development.
I think some of them have, particularly some of the skills that have to do with power and autonomy have been used. Not that broadly yet, but the sense that if you're going to empower leaders, empower anyone, you have to find a way to shore up their sense of being in control. I think that's understood. I think the being valued in community has not been that widely connected yet. And I think what we want to stress here today is that you need the two in combination. You can't just focus on how people feel about themselves. You have to pay attention to how others are feeling about them and how that's being reflected in their own feelings. So to make a more succinct answer, they have been used somewhat, but I would say not nearly enough.
Okay, great. Another Hazel question. You suggest communicating some of the responses, so using the scales and communicating what you find, but can you imagine situations where a very small organization might then need to establish an institutional review board because of the data it's collecting and how it might like to use the data? So I guess the gist of that question is, does kind of implementing a measurement, any kind of a measurement program, maybe necessitate a bit of infrastructure around ethics and regulation?
Oh, absolutely, and I'm very much a fan of institutional review boards. We definitely need them, but why we think the partnership toolkit can be so helpful is because what we will have there is the documentation and the evidence that these scales have been widely used and they are reliable and valid, and that they have been vetted by a wide variety of other institutional review boards for use with low-income populations. So that it should be a real asset to people who are trying to get their review boards to okay them.
Okay, great. Just a general note, we've gotten a number of questions and comments regarding whether or not the slides and the recording will be posted. Absolutely yes, and we'll have those online by early next week. On the same event page you use to find out about the webinar, they'll be available there. Let's see. Another question for Hazel. There's been a lot of discussion over the past several years about the concept of grit and how people might develop it. Is that something we should be measuring?
Grit is very much a component of power and autonomy. So grit scales will say setbacks don't discourage me. So it's just, or I finish what I begin. So very much a similar concept to the sense of control that is spelled out. And grit has not yet been as widely used in low-income and poverty contexts, but it's very overlapping in its sense of I feel that I can do what I set out to do in my life. That's really the core of it. It's just kind of finding a way to say that seems to work in your population. You know, you have to tune it for if you have youth and younger people, or if you have older people. But it's this: I can do what I want to do. I can meet my goals. I can make my decisions, and I can kind of hang on to those goals. I think grit is a very nice word for talking about what this sense of control and mastery is all about. Self-efficacy is another word that's and has been used, commonly. Self-esteem is also related to this. So many of these terms are really capturing the same phenomenon, and that's why we're so confident about why we need to measure this power and autonomy. It makes a difference for people. Why some people can have these feelings and others can't, that's what we're going after, and why we need so much more research on poverty context.
Great. Another Hazel question. This comes from Jody Reynaud with Esperanza. What are some of the ways that direct service organizations are already using to apply these learnings in the context of their existing programs? For example, I guess using the tools to affect students and clients' sense of empowerment, agency, self-determination. I guess generally just a question about
Right.
any news from the field about using these scales.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think you can use the scale to try to measure the people in the groups and populations that you're working with, but you can also use the content of these scales to try to design various narratives that you put forth about your programs as you're working with youth, talking about both of these aspects, about the importance of feeling empowered, of feeling that you have autonomy or agency, and also the importance of feeling included in your community. And what we find, and many people working now in organizations, various types of organizations, find that talking to the people you're working with about, when do you feel included? Why don't you feel included? What matters? What gives you a good sense that you can keep going today, that you can follow your goals, or what keeps you from doing that is a very effective way to get some information that will allow you to tune and tweak the program that you have now. And then also, there's a lot of work that's being done to interventions, randomized control studies that present programs and ideas or policies in one way or another to show that many of our well-meaning programs actually can end up undermining people's sense of their autonomy because they're too restrictive, they're too demanding of people. There has to be some of that, but there can't be too much. And sometimes they pay too little attention to just if people feel that this is a good place, if they belong there. To the extent that if people feel at home and they feel included in whatever it is that you're doing, that this is a place for, as in the belongingness scale, like people like me can do well here, or people like me are valued here. That seems to be a really key feature of any program, and doing it in some way that's not too heavy-handed, but sort of a bit stealth seems to work well.
Great. Another technical question for Hazel. This comes from Julie Berkeley with United South End Settlements. So within the measures I'll paraphrase Julie's question, within the measurements that you discussed in the presentation itself and those pointed to in the references, are there any that can be used with children, particularly children under 12 years of age, or are they all for adults?
Oh, it's a good question, and I'd say we have been paying particular attention to that because we know how many organizations are working with youth now and care about this. And I would say that many of them can be used with children now or pretty easily adapted. You can just you can simplify the wording without taking away the meaning. The scale, for example, the ladder, is one that has been used with children, and kids understand that very well, and they can place themselves on the ladder. The belongingness scale works very well. You can talk with second graders about whether you feel that you belong in this class, or whether you feel like you're one of the people that can do well here. It works beautifully.
Great. This question is also for Hazel. It comes from, I'm going to paraphrase, but this comes from David Rosen with the Open Door Collective. So you've mentioned this bi-directional relationship between health and poverty. And he's asking, are you also looking at the impact of family poverty on children's educational outcomes?
Yes, of course. I had the one slide on the effects of belongingness on school performance, grades in school. I mean, educational performance is a critical outcome, a critical dependent variable, and there's actually more research on that even than health. So we will include those very much in the toolkit. I think we highlighted health today because that's the relatively newer outcome, and one of those kind of master outcomes that makes such a difference, like education, to everything else. But yes, and particularly with respect to belongingness, when children feel that they belong in school, that school is the place for them, and that people like them can do well there, which doesn't happen in most school settings in the country right now, sadly. But when that happens, children can really thrive. And we need to understand what are the conditions, including many more material resources, of course, for schools. Schools need them. But what else can be done that will be relatively low cost, but can give children the sense that this school is a place for them?
Great. Well, that happened incredibly quickly, but somehow we're at the end of our time. Thank you all so much for joining us. If you've benefited from any of the information today, you can get more at our website, www.mobilitypartnership.org. And in particular, we really want to invite you to tune in online Thursday, May 3rd, beginning at 8:45 a.m. Eastern Time and run until 1 p.m. for our culminating event, Dramatically Increasing Mobility from Poverty, where you'll hear from some of the community voices who have really inspired us, hear discussions of some of the partnership's ideas and strategies, and where people will look ahead to what may come next with some of these ideas. So that's next Thursday, May 3rd at 8:45 a.m. That will also be recorded, so you'll have access to that in a number of ways. So I want to thank Nisha and Hazel for everything you presented today, and we look forward to as many of you as possible joining us next Thursday online. Thanks again.
Thanks, Lionel. It was a pleasure.